Vietnam declared independence following World War II and the defeat of Japanese forces, setting the stage for 3 decades of US intervention, which would cost the lives of up to nearly 4 million people in Vietnam, hundreds of thousands in Cambodia and Laos, and over 58,000 American service personnel. This is Working Class History. Today we continue our series of episodes about the Vietnam War, and I'm very pleased to be joined by author and activist, and perhaps the world's foremost critic of US foreign policy, Noam Chomsky. With Professor Chomsky, we explore the geopolitics of the conflict and what the rationale was for US military involvement, and we examine the prevailing intellectual and media narratives about the conflict. Then we're going to look at the human cost of the war, primarily on the civilian population of the region. Professor Chomsky, can you tell us what was the background to US involvement in Vietnam?
Well, the background begins right after the Second World War. At that point, the US was in a position of overwhelming power with no precedent in history. Planners knew about it. They'd been planning for it for several years because they assumed that that would be the outcome of the war. And it was in a position to try to organize and determine the structure of almost the entire post-war world. And there were several conflicting concerns, and Vietnam falls right within them. One goal was to create what was called an open society, a society in which, in practice, it would mean US-based enterprises would be free to invest, to exploit resources, and so on. It was to be a level playing field, but level means the guy with all the power wins, just like Britain a century earlier, when it came out in favor of laissez-faire after it was way ahead of everyone else. It was approximately the same in 1945. So one principle was try to create an open world system. But however, that conflicted with another priority to ensure that Europe would reconstruct and be an essential partner, sort of client partner of the United States. But for Europe to reconstruct after the war, it had to have access to the resources of its former colonies. And there was a conflict because the U.S. wanted to break up the imperial preference systems, but on the other hand, it sort of needed them, at least temporarily, to allow Europe to reconstruct to be the center for U.S. investment and trade and so on, and also for geostrategic reasons, to be a client in the world order. And if you take a look, the U.S. made different decisions in different places. So, for example, in what's now Indonesia, which was a Dutch colony, after a couple of years, by 1948, the United States decided to support the independence movements against the Dutch. That was after they had carried out an effective anti-communist massacre, which gave them credentials. In Vietnam, the U.S. was initially fairly sympathetic to the Vietnamese liberation movement. France was trying to reconquer its former colony. But by 1949, that changed. When China became independent, what's called in the United States the loss of China, which is a very revealing expression. It indicates the assumptions of the time. But after the loss of China, U.S. policy was recalibrated for all of Asia, and the U.S. decided to support France in its reconquest of Vietnam. Then was bitter war, went on for several years. Finally, the U.S. provided almost all the arms and so on, but ultimately France decided to withdraw in 1954. A settlement was reached, the Geneva settlement. The U.S. regarded it as a disaster. An official documents tell us, decided not to uphold it and insisted on, according to the Geneva Agreements, there was to be an election in 1946, 56, which would unify the country, but the U.S. decided to cancel the election and establish the state of South Vietnam. The reasons were quite explicit. They were spelled out clearly in internal documents. The basic reason was what's called the domino theory. They didn't call it that, but the idea was that if Indochina became independent, if Vietnam became an independent state and pursued a course of successful development, it might influence others. The way Henry Kissinger described it later, speaking of Chile under Allende, it would be a virus that might spread contagion. And the idea was that it would spread contagion to Burma and to Thailand and might even influence Indonesia, which was really important. The United States didn't care that much about Indochina, but Indonesia was a big place with very rich resources. And after that, it might even reach as far as Japan. Japan might accommodate to an independent East Asia, become its technological and commercial center. And that would, in effect, reconstitute the world order that Japan was trying to create during the Second World War, that the U.S. fought to prevent. And in the early 1950s, the United States was not ready to lose the Second World War in the Pacific. Japan was what the leading Asia historian, John Dower, called the super domino. That's what they were really concerned about. Well, how do you deal with a virus that's going to spread contagion? It's pretty straightforward. Kill the virus, inoculate the potential targets by imposing harsh military dictatorships which prevent any spread of the contagion. And that's pretty much the history of what follows. You could go through the details. Through the 1950s, the U.S. instituted a client state in South Vietnam, which was pretty brutal. It killed maybe 60, 70,000 people. It elicited resistance from inside. North Vietnam didn't really want to get involved. They had their own problems of reconstructing the society after a terrible war. But finally, by the late 50s, North Vietnam agreed to support the Southern resistance, which the Southern U.S. government couldn't control. John F. Kennedy came into office, sharply escalated the war, sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnamese targets, mostly in the rural areas, authorized napalm, initiated programs to drive the peasants into what were called strategic hamlets, basically concentration camps. The idea is to, using the Maoist metaphor, to drain the sea so that the guerrillas would not have a base. And then it went on from there. And in fact, although it's called a U.S. defeat, that's very misleading. The U.S. did not succeed in turning Vietnam into an obedient colony, but on the other hand, it achieved its major goals. Vietnam is not a successful independent country that will be a model for others, and the region was in fact protected by vicious dictatorships in every surrounding country. In fact, in the main and most important one was Indonesia in 1965. General Suharto carried out a coup in Indonesia, slaughtered maybe 500,000 or 1 million people, wiped out the only mass-based party. This was greeted with utter euphoria in the West, unconcealed euphoria in United States, England, Australia. They couldn't contain themselves with joy. And it meant that Indonesia was safe. It wouldn't fall. In fact, years later, McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, reflected that might have been a good idea to stop the Vietnam War in 1965. South Vietnam was already pretty much destroyed. Vietnam altogether was severely damaged. The surrounding areas were all protected. So the logic of the intervention had essentially succeeded. The United States was not innovating anything in this respect. The domino theory is often ridiculed when the dominoes don't fall. But then you have to ask yourself, why didn't they fall? Well, I just described the reason. But the domino theory is never abandoned because it's correct. It's absolutely correct. It goes way back into the history of imperialism. If Americans ought to be well aware of it, the American Revolution was regarded exactly the same way by the Europeans. King George III was concerned that if the American colonies achieved independence, the British Empire would begin to erode. Others would try to follow the same course, and pretty soon Britain would just be a small island off the coast of Europe. The continental leaders, the Tsar of Russia, Metternich, and so on, were deeply concerned about what they called the threat of republicanism and popular government that might spread from the American colonies elsewhere, and that would destroy the old order. So it's just an old story. Every imperial coward does it. The U.S. does it all the time. And that's the basic history of the Vietnam War. It's not the way it's described almost ever. But if you look at the internal documents and the framework, that's pretty much what happened. Meanwhile, Indochina was virtually destroyed. The war spread to Laos and Cambodia. All sorts of hideous things took place. Vietnam has sort of begun to recover, but within pretty much the U.S. orbit. I should say it was always clear, except to American strategists, that Vietnam was not concerned with America. It was concerned with China. I can tell you a personal anecdote if you like. I visited North Vietnam in 1970 at the peak of the bombing. It was very intense at the time. There was a short bombing pause, and they invited me to come to lecture at the ruins of the Polytechnic University, which I did for several days. But I met with the usual high officials and so on. And they couldn't have been clearer. Their basic message is, you guys are destroying us, but you're going to go away. That country up there is not going to go away. Now, that's the one we're worried about. American strategists, leaders, CIA could never figure this out. I mean, that was their concern all along. And now it's, in retrospect, should be obvious. In fact, by 1975, Vietnam was at war with China, but 1980. But I think that's the fundamental story.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And as you say, that's not the standard account which is given by conservative or even liberal commentators, which is typified by a recent documentary series by Ken Burns, which kind of put across the standard kind of explanation that essentially, in people in the Soviet Union, ordinary people had a tough time, and they wanted to stop people experiencing those same problems in Vietnam.
Well, the Burns approach is the standard one. The United States tried to save South Vietnam from the threat of communism. It was a tragic error, maybe a strategic blunder. We tried our best, put out 60,000 Americans died, fought hard, but just couldn't carry it off, and it was an American defeat. That's the liberal version. The conservative right-wing version is we were stabbed in the back. If we'd really fought harder, we could have won. But between those extremes, that's virtually 100% of intellectual discussion. Quite interestingly, it's not the opinion of the public. It's almost never reported. You can find this out if you like. The Chicago Council of Foreign Affairs carries out regular careful polling of public opinion. And at the end of the war in 1975 and on for about 15 years after that, among the questions that they asked were questions about the Vietnam War. And about 2/3 of the population said they thought the war was, I'm quoting, fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Try to find that anywhere in intellectual discourse. That's 70% of the public. Now, what they meant by that, you really can't be certain. The director of the survey, John Really, a well-known social scientist, he commented once and said, well, what it means is people don't want to waste our resources in foreign wars. That's one possibility. The other possibility is they thought that what they said, that it's fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. But they never dared to ask a follow-up question to determine that. So you can make your own decision.
On a similar note, the same, documentary series kind of, and other liberal commentators have done the same, have kind of implied that the US was essentially held hostage in some way by the South Vietnamese regime, because they'd said they'd support it. They were essentially had to, do what the South wanted, and they were just put in a difficult situation. Is that an accurate depiction of what happened?
It's very easy to test that. In the Kennedy regime, which in fact is the one that really escalated it, Johnson went much farther. I guess it was August 1963, the Kennedy administration discovered, this is a couple of months before the assassination, the Kennedy administration discovered that the South Vietnamese regime that they had installed, the Diem regime, was negotiating with the North for a peaceful diplomatic settlement of the war. Well, if they'd wanted to get out, that's a perfect opportunity. Say, here's the diplomatic settlement. We did our job. Goodbye. What they did, however, was initiate a military coup to overthrow the government and install a very hawkish general. Diem and his brother happened to be killed, and while it was done, that was not the plan, but it happened. But they did install the harshest general they could find, and from then on continued like that. Now, that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, and that obviously matches the pattern of US involvement elsewhere in the world as well. So thanks.
Same story almost everywhere. And as I say, it's not the US. Britain did the same. France did the same.
Oh, yeah, no, of course, yeah. And the Belgians and,
Just run through the list.
Yeah. So at the time that the US intervention was starting, what was the US media saying about it and about the reasons for it?
Just standard anti-communist propaganda. Communists trying to take over the world. We're defending freedom, so on. In fact, when Kennedy first sent the U.S. Air Force to bomb South Vietnam, which was a significant escalation, I think the New York Times had a 10-line comment on some back page. It was totally insignificant. It was very hard to try to initiate anti-war protest. When I got started giving talks in the early 60s, at the time of the Kennedy escalation, I was literally talking in people's living rooms or in a church with 4 people or something. Meetings were broken up. Public demonstrations were violently attacked. Churches were attacked. It wasn't until about 1967, by which time South Vietnam had been virtually destroyed, that a substantial opposition to the war developed in the United States.
Later on in the war, what sort of anti-war activities did you get involved in?
By 1965, trying to organize national tax resistance. By 1966, a number of us were moving on to organize much broader resistance to the war, support for draft resistance, deserters, others. In fact, by 1968, I was already facing a federal trial for resistance activities. It was called off after the Tet Offensive, and by then there was a large anti-war movement. There were demonstrations, protests, and so on. Went on till virtually the end.
You personally had the honour of being put on Nixon's notorious enemies list. Am I right?
That was an honor. Most of my friends were jealous.
Did you experience any negative consequences as a result of that?
Not from that. In fact, it was kind of surprising. I had been organizing criminal activities like tax resistance, support for resistance, but the pressures were not, any pressures were, you couldn't claim were illegitimate, because they were openly, publicly, what are regarded as illegal activities.
We're currently working on an episode about the movement against the Vietnam War in the US. One person we interviewed, Vivian Rothstein, an anti-war activist, sent us a recording she made in 1967 of a Mrs. Van, a member of the Vietnamese Women's Union, which was taken on tour to be played at meetings of anti-war women. In our view, it's a really important snapshot of people's history, and it gives a vivid but horrific picture of what Vietnamese people, and Vietnamese women in particular, suffered. So we're going to play it for you. But listeners should be aware that it contains descriptions of torture and sexual violence.
I've been active over these 20 years in the struggle of my people for our independence. It dates from the resistance war against the French colonialists. I've been a student in Saigon. My family lives in Saigon, but now I'm teaching in the Liberate Zone. I'm married and have a 3-year-old little son. I've made this step for my American friends who are interested about the Vietnam War. I'd like to tell you about the suffering our people and our women in South Vietnam have been daily enduring since July 1954, the date of the signing of the Geneva Agreements, which ended victoriously our 9-year-long resistance war against the French colonialists. If these agreements were not violated by the US government and their lackeys, the Saigon government, we should have known peace and independence these 13 years. Because we just demanded peace and reunification of our country. Hundreds of thousands of our people, among them thousands of women and children, have been arrested, tortured, or killed. If the imprisoned people escape from jail, they are invalid for life because of the tortures. When a group of 4 American women came to Hanoi, North Vietnam, at the beginning of this year, they could meet some of our sisters who have been victims of the tortures in US jails, and who have been secretly brought to North Vietnam to receive treatment in hospitals. These American women have been particularly upset with the case of Tran Thi Ly, a 29-year-old girl, native from Quang Nam province, who has been under treatment for over 7 years now, but has not yet recovered. She was arrested at 18 during a demonstration to ask for the implementation of the Geneva Agreements for general elections to reunify the country. In the prison, she was tied up, and the torturers applied electric currents to her ears, nose, lips, breasts, private parts. They used red-hot pincers to tear off pieces of flesh from her shoulders, thighs, breasts, and belly. From the appearance, she's quite a very nice-looking girl with beautiful eyes, which startle everybody. Many poets from North Vietnam and from friendly countries which have come in hospital to see her have written many beautiful poems on her, especially to praise her courage before faced with her torturers. But she's completely wrecked inside. One can't help being very deeply grieved for her when you think that such a young and charming person would never know love, happiness, and can never be a wife and mother like ordinary people. I'll tell you another case, that of Sister Muay, a young peasant girl of the Mekong Delta, 23 years old. She's a very tiny girl, 1.50 meters tall. She just looks like a child. She has been active from 18 years old in leading all the political struggles of her fellow villagers. I should tell you a little about what political struggles are. Women flock, thousands of them, to the offices of the puppet administration to ask for the cessation of bombing, cessation of spraying of toxic chemicals on their villages. And they argue with the officials of the puppet administration to ask for compensation of their properties, asking for the release of prisoners, and so on. So Muay began to work to lead the people to hold such demonstrations since she was 18. And through 3 years, until she was arrested, 21, she led nearly 100 political struggles face to face with the enemy. Her arguments were always very sharp and clear, very effective. So many times the demonstrations she led were successful. The enemy had to give compensation. When she was arrested at 21st, she was savagely tortured. Her 2 legs completely crushed. The torturers threw her into a barrel full of water, then apply an electric current through the water. She fell into unconsciousness many times, but every time she came to, she were again thrown into the barrel and exposed to such tortures. But she won't tell anything about the other activists and cadres. After 1 year's detention and tortures, she was released, and I could meet her at the time of her release, and I've lived with her for some time. She didn't quite completely recover till now. Her whole body, her tiny body, I told you, she's looking like a child, just like a child. Her whole body has suffered so much from the electric shocks that whenever there was a stormy weather and there was a lightning, her whole body would jump and shrivel. We pitied her so much, poor little thing, that many of us cried because we didn't know how we could do to help her. One day, one of my friends had the idea of tying a wire to her body and plant the other end of the wire into the earth. It proved to be a good idea because she felt some relief. From that time, we always had a reel of wire with us, and every time there was a storm, we set her in a hammock, tied the wire around her, and planted its end into the earth. So she felt relieved. We all were very moved by her youth and her courage faced to her torturers. There are thousands of women and girls like Tran Thi Ly and Little Mui in South Vietnam. Over the past 3 years, with the massive dispatch of nearly 1.5 million American troops and 56,000 troops of the American satellite countries, the sufferings of our women have still increased. Most of victims of their so-called search and destroy operations are women and children. During these raids, raping is considered as part of the fighting task of the GIs. There is raping en masse. Many women have been raped to death, others killed immediately after being raped. In the towns, high costs of living, rising taxes, misery have driven many honest women to an impasse, either to take to prostitution or to die of starvation. The Saigon administration has established official brothels at American bases at Da Nang, Pleiku, etc. These facts are great offenses to the moral and traditional virtues of our women and are the biggest crimes that the American government has committed towards our people and our generations to come. Never shall our people tolerate these crimes to go unpunished. A Vietnamese saying tells, "In face of invaders, women should fight as men." Faced with the tragedy of their families being broken, their beloved ones being killed mercilessly, their own lives being threatened at any moment, simple peasant women, even illiterate, have risen up with all the strength of their patriotism to take up arms and have accomplished many worthy acts. Women also take part in armed struggle, especially among the guerrillas. They organize ambushes, attack armored cars, down US planes. Sometimes one team of women guerrillas put out of action and drive away some 100-men-strong units. Mrs. Nguyen Thi Ut, an heroine of the Liberation Army, a mother of 6 children, together with her husband, has participated in many engagements and fought the enemy by all ways and means. We are very proud of our sister, Mrs. Nguyen Thi Dinh, the president of the South Vietnam Women's Union for Liberation and deputy commander of the South Vietnamese Liberation Armed Forces. Despite bombing, women work actively to build a new life in liberated zones. In many localities, 60% of women are men workers because men have gone into the army. The women strive to increase production on over 2 million hectares of land allotted to them by the National Liberation Front in order to self-supply and supplying the army. The Vietnamese women also actively participate in health, cultural and educational work. Many women medical cadres, midwives and teachers have been trained. In the liberated zone, 80% children of school age can go to school. In one province, there are 94 school mistresses out of a number of 98 teachers. There are thousands of women, civil and military doctors, medical workers in the liberated zone. Though the conditions of living are very hard, we do not lose confidence and are determined with our entire people to wage a struggle until complete victory. When we say that we are proud of our women, of the role they are playing, it's not boasting. Never before our women could bring into full play all their capabilities as we are doing now. We are proud because we are building a new life out of countless hardships under the leadership of the South Vietnam National Front for Liberation, the leadership of our organization, the Women's Union for Liberation of South Vietnam. The life we are building now is a new life of self-dignity for ourselves and for our entire people. We understand that the American people, among them the women, are waging a hard struggle to demand their government to end the Vietnam War. But we are confident that this hard struggle will be successful because there is no reason for young Americans to go and die in a country thousands of miles far from home. Neither there is any reason for the American people's lives to be twisted by this war. We wish to you, our American sisters, many courage and good success in your fight for a better life, for civil rights and racial equality, and for a quick end to the Vietnam War. May peace be quickly restored to our country so that our two peoples may live in peace and friendship. Thank you.
Despite the brutality of the US military, the South Vietnamese regime and their other allies, and their collective punishment of the Vietnamese civilian population, they were unable to stamp out the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, or North Vietnamese forces. As covered in our episodes 10 and 11, the 2.7 million US service personnel who served in Vietnam had become less and less willing to fight as well, and were becoming more rebellious. And at home, the anti-war movement had reached a critical mass with regular huge protests and disruption, which meant that the American government couldn't afford politically to send more troops or money. So the war finally ended in 1975 with victory for North Vietnam, who inherited destroyed cities, a traumatized population, and a devastated countryside. That's it for today's episode, Our episode 8 in the Vietnam series is about the strike wave in the US during the war. Episodes 10 and 11 are about the GI resistance. Episode 12 is about revolutionary black workers organising in Detroit during the conflict. And coming soon, we've got an episode with Vivian Rothstein and others about the US anti-war movement. So do watch this space. Noam Chomsky's book, Who Rules the World, is out now and available in the show notes below. Also in the show notes are links to background information and further reading. Thanks to our Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible. You too can support us on Patreon and get exclusive early access to episodes, bonus audio and more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. This episode was edited by Emma Cortland and Stephanie Heidel. Catch you next time.
Để trường sự liên quan thương yêu thương ta dung phong đi giữa cùng vai ra vai chung một bóng cờ vùng lên dân Việt Nam anh hùng vùng lên vượt qua bao vùng thề cứu lấy nước nhà để hy sinh đến cùng cầm cờ